looking at black, you can always hit reset camera and you'll be back. Also, it looks like this got rotated a little bit. Okay, so we're back to normal.
How do you delete? I mean, it's really clean that you can just select the keyframe and delete it.
Yeah.
Is there really like reset for the entire track? Said you had like 10 keyframes.
Yeah. So say if I had like this. Okay, there's a bug. I'll show you this. So you can do Apple A.
So you're going to need footage?
If you do Apple A, it selects everything. Delete. So control, select all. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is a camera move. So this timeline is locked. So as I move through the timeline, you can see it's moving through the video frame. So it's as long as the video. So the way the camera works is obviously no matter what video frame you're on, you have this sort of still moment that you can move around. And what we want to do is animate a track through space that says, I want to look at one thing at one time, and then I want the video to move forward, and by the time it gets somewhere else, I want to be looking at a different perspective. So let's say, for example, I want to zoom in, so I want to be looking at our friend Nicolas this way, at this moment in time, so my playhead is here, I'm on frame 299, and I'm looking at Nicolas from this perspective. If I hit set camera point up here, then I get this little mark, which is a keyframe. That says, you can't visually see anything, but what it means is I've set a camera point at this position from this angle when I hit that. So that means I can move the camera now, and let's say right when the clap happens, I'll zoom in on that clap. And I can always use the arrow keys to move through the footage too if I want to see a precise moment. So I want to zoom in on that clap and take this really dramatic angle. So I'm not that far away, so I've moved a little bit ahead in time. And if I want more granularity, I can use this slider at the bottom, just zoom in. So it's kind of like the slider in Final Cut. So this just zooms in on the timeline. Kind of narrows the range. Does that make sense to everybody? If you have Final Cut, it should be fairly intuitive. So that's the amount of frames between where I was and where I am now. So I'm going to set a camera point there. Okay? And if you guys have footage, please be following along, or you can just film me with your phone. Mo's following along.
I can't cook. Oh, no, I can't. No, I can't.
Can I see you working? So it looks like you're just zoomed in way too far. Okay, so now if I hit Shift L, that locks me to track. Notice how this is flashy blue. So flashy blue means that I'm now, the perspective is locked to, it'll go right back to whatever I had before. So I'm stuck on that camera track. And that means as I scrub through the footage, I move through time, I move through space as well. So if I hit play, I'll execute that camera track. Now it's really short, so I'm going to just open this up a little bit. So I just dragged that keyframe from here and I dragged it all the way over to here. So I made that camera move longer. So now we can watch that movement. So it was a little bit too quick, so let's figure out what to do afterwards. So I hit Shift L again to unlock. See how it locks and unlocks? The beginning and end point gets set on this, and it means that my camera can then move again freely. So this mode is for composing camera moves. Once it's locked, it's for actually previewing the moves back. So I'm going to unlock, and I'm going to go over here, and then I'm going to go far in the future. See, I put the playhead down here, and I want to set another camera move. So now my camera goes like this. It sweeps in and comes back out the other side. So I can go back here, and I go back there, and if I play,
like this.
so we can make that way more dramatic. Say instead of being here, like I scrub to the middle keyframe, I want to actually zoom way out. So I can unlock that track, and I can zoom way out. Say even further, make it really dramatic. And then I'll delete what was there before and set it again. So now I've just reset that position to be way out here. So now I'll have a really dramatic camera move. Out and in. And then if I want something else at the end, I can just set another camera point so it'll wait a little bit longer. So this is basically making a roller coaster through space on which your camera moves. And you can't really see it, but you explore it by turning on the lock to track and scrubbing through the timeline to see what you're staring at.
Is there a way to quick key jump between
keyframes?
Keyframes?
No, actually, there's not. That would be a great feature. Kind of like an After Effects, like next.
Yeah, or like colons.
Yeah. That would be dope.
What is the key move for lock unlock?
Shift L.
Shift L.
It's also, watch this. So Shift L is exactly the same as turning lock to track on and off.
Okay. So it's a toggle.
It's a toggle.
Shift
You're
L,
either
Shift
locked to
L.
track and then you're stuck. Like you can't see it. Whatever I do, it ends up going right back to the track. It's like there's a line through space.
Okay.
And then
Clear in front, like this. Excellent.
okay. So now let's talk, that's camera move. So let's spice this up a little bit and make it look better than just the mesh. So first I'll start with clipping. A lot of times you want to delete the background. What if I just wanted this fan? So I'd go to clipping, my clipping, geometry tab, and here there's a threshold min and Z threshold max. So this lets you remove parts of the foreground and background. So by scrubbing this, I'm actually deleting anything that is greater than a certain Z depth. So it allows me to isolate the foreground. This is a weird little face. Someone's like, peeking aside. So
Alessandro he was moving the fan around.
That's hilarious. So I want to let's say I just want to isolate the fan. Now I can watch this again.
Clear in front.
And everything from the foreground, or the background is gone. Now, it might be weird, but maybe I want to get rid of the foreground. I can do the same thing by turning up the Z threshold min, which gets rid of the foreground, and now I've deleted just the
Clear in
fan.
front, like this.
So you just have shadows.
Excellent.
So it's kind of like you have a box in space, and you're setting thresholds for the front and the back. That's the geometry tab. There's also on this tab the simplification. So this is easier to see in wireframe mode. So I'm going to turn off mesh and turn on wireframe. No mesh. So now it's just the wireframe mode. So if I zoom in, if I literally physically zoom in, this also oftentimes gets slower because it's drawing so many fine lines. So your frame rate may drop when you're in this mode. But I'm going to walk in here, and this is actually what's being drawn, is all of these little lines. So these are all vertices, and they're all being positioned based, it's really a grid that's being positioned in 3D space based on the depth image. So if you've done any 3D graphics, it's like a distortion map. So what the simplification does is it increases the distance between these lines. So right now this is almost the lowest simplification looks like this. Oh, it's wobbling a little bit. That's awesome. Let's turn off warp. Okay, so this is the lowest simplification. This actually looks really bad when you're far away because all of the lines get so thick that they just kind of additively blend together and turn to muck. So what we do is we add in the Simplify tab, Simplify X and Simplify Y, we can actually introduce negative space into those these. So if I simplify X, I end up with these very long, stretched out polygons. If I simplify Y, it increases the space between each row. So then I can actually introduce negative space into this. And then you start to get the effect of where you're actually seeing that it's made up of all these points. And it's also way faster because you're drawing less geometry. So now you can kind of see what that looks like as a wireframe. So that's, again, in the geometry tab, that's simplification. And that affects almost every effect in here. Is like, if it's too dense, turn up simplification. If it's too sparse, turn it down. Any questions on that? Okay. And you can also keyframe this smoothly, which kind of looks cool sometimes. Because then you'll see the lines like moving closer together. So I'll leave the simplification fairly high. There's also this clipping. Edge clipping is the ability to remove these long polygons. It's like scissors, basically. So if I start to turn on edge clipping, it'll get rid of the polygons that have been stretched between two surfaces. And sometimes you want to do that if you really wanted to isolate this fan.
Like this.
Is that geometry also?
That is now in clipping. So a lot of times you don't like this aesthetic of these stretches. You want to actually make the people look more like cardboard cutouts or paper cutouts. Then you can turn on the edge clipping. So I'll show more clearly what that's doing. So here is a surface that when it ends here, the very next pixel is back here because you're looking at really just a 2D picture of the world, even though it describes 3D. So this is a maximum tolerance for how long these polygons can get stretched out. This is one triangle that's stretched all the way from the foreground to the background. Lots of times that aesthetic looks really bad, so you want to have a control to be able to turn all those off. Sometimes it looks cool, so it's a choice. And you can also animate it. Go in between, it can be neat sometimes because then you get like striations. And they'll like flicker in and out like that. Also, I should mention these effects are all additive. So if I turn on draw mesh, I get both. I get the mesh with the wireframe screen blended above it. So that way you can start to do additive effects as you pile these features on. And otherwise you wouldn't see a wireframe at all. So the wireframe comes in as a little bit glowy, but it's still using the color from before. So it's a screen blending from like Photoshop, basically.
Excellent.
Okay, so I'll keep mesh off. So now you can also, this just as a feature, you can clip the top, you can clip the bottom or the sides. So this just allows you to get rid of stuff that you don't like. Maybe your calibration, your camera, often this will be used if your camera wasn't totally covering the depth image like we dealt with yesterday. Maybe you just want to clip that part off so you don't see that weirdness. You can also animate these to do some cool effects like scrub. So if I scrub through, also with the timeline, holding down Shift lets you select multiple keyframes. So you can animate these to kind of create cool wipes in between. And notice that because you're doing it in 2D, it actually looks kind of like a door swinging open. Like the stuff in the foreground isn't affected at the same plane as the stuff in the background. So there's some potential there for fun animation. And deleting all of those, also if something gets messed up, just delete the keyframe. Generally it has a pretty intelligent default value. Rotation is also pretty obvious. It lets you just, swing stuff around in a circle. So if you wanted to, if I wanted to spin this thing, I can just rotate and that's different than rotating the camera. It's actually shifting the geometry in space. So that's the rotation tab. So I went through those. So those last two were the clipping and the rotation tab. So rendering tab is where things get interesting. This is where you specify the relative brightnesses of all the different geometry and a few other things. So generally the way rendering works is there's a checkbox for every one of the features to just turn it on and off. And then there's also an alpha slider to affect how much it comes in. So if ever you're turning something on and you don't see it take effect, check to make sure your alpha is on. So here I turned on point grid, but if I had my point alpha all the way at 0 potentially, then I would turn that on and I wouldn't see anything. So here I don't see anything right now, but that's because my point grid is at 0. So I just grab this keyframe, drag it up, and now I get my point cloud. The density of the point cloud is also affected by the simplification. So you're like, oh, I want a denser point cloud. I just turn down my simplification. I literally have more points in the scene. Point size is pretty self-explanatory. You can go big, you can go small. They get kind of fuzzy. Everything's additive blended again, or screen blended. So stuff like this looks cool because there's different it's taking all that information from the material. Again, when you look at things from the side, they tend to have more of that 3D feel because you get relative adding and removing. When you're looking things straight on, it tends to be more of a grid. If you don't like the grid effect, but you like the point cloud, you can turn on points random instead of point grid. And this is the new feature for the version 6. So this actually just has a sparse spattering of random points, kind of look like noise. And you can control and keyframe the amount of them through the random point amount. The alpha and the size are controlled by the same sliders. So I'll turn on a few of those. I'll turn down the amount. So wireframe is your normal wireframe. And this wireframe looks cross-hatched. You can see this. It's like if I look at this grid, it's a standard mesh winding from video games, so it's squares made out of triangles with a line in between. If you don't like this crosshatch, there's a whole other feature called scanline. So let me show you the difference here. So here's wireframe. And you can control it with wireframe alpha and wireframe thickness. You can make it thicker, thinner. But you can also, so let's turn that off. And let's turn on start with just horizontal lines. So see, they're starting to come in here. So this is drawing the whole scene with just horizontal lines. So they kind of look like a Radetra sort of thing. And for here, I have my horizontal scanline alpha and my horizontal scanline thickness. So I can make them fade in and out, and I can make them thicker or thinner. So very thick or very thin. Same is true for vertical. I can turn on just vertical lines, and I have the same independent controls for those. I also like these controls because they're independent from one another. So you can have very thin vertical lines and thick horizontal lines, and that can make things look nicer. If you turn them both on, you're basically back to the wireframe mesh, only this time you don't have that crossbeam, which aesthetically can look better. It looks more like a woven mesh versus like a wireframe. These are also affected by the simplification. So if you want more thickness on either thing, control it through the simplify. A fun technique is to turn on both lines and points. So draw a point grid as well, and then under rendering, turn the point alpha up. Oh, I'm going to turn off random points. So now we get this effect where there's these wires with little dots, and that can look really cool sometimes. So you can see there's a little dot at each intersection. Also, if you just had one on, you get these kind of like dotted lines. Okay, so that's scan line. So now that's all the techniques of visualization. It's really three formats. It's points, lines, and mesh. So it kind of builds up that way. So now we have a little bit of distortion. Oh, I want to show you one other thing, sorry. There's a tab called self-occlude. What the self-occlude does is a lot of times you want to have a lot of negative space, but you don't want it to be see-through where there's actually a surface. So if you turn on self-occlude, it means that, okay, so don't draw anything, so still describe the negative space, but don't let the background show through. And this can be really helpful for people if you don't want them to look really ghosty. And because oftentimes, especially if you're trying to bring a figure out against the background, you want the background there because this is a nice wash on it, it looks really good, it gives it a sense of space. But turn self-occlude on if you want to make sure that that person really pops against the foreground, against the background. And so you can see these stretched out triangles here are just black because they're occluding that space. So that's the self-occlude tab. But I'll leave that off for now. So next we have a little bit of distortion. So let's start with the wave distort. So first I have to turn on wave distort so it actually works. And now waves, it's literally just sending a sine wave through the geometry. So here I turned on the wave amplitude, so this affects how much it's being distorted. So right now, the frequency is very, very low. So it's just basically one huge oscillator moving through the geometry. I can make it faster or slower. I could also animate that. But if you want to actually distort it, you well, technically down the frequency. This is named wrong. But you turn this frequency, change the frequency value, and then you actually start to see the oscillator moving through. So you get these sine waves. And you can animate the speed on that if you want it to be really fast, really slow, or very subtle. Also, these parameters can be very touchy sometimes, so just using the arrow keys moves them ever so minute amount. Holding down shift and moving the arrow key is a little bit more. So oftentimes you want to dial in the exact value you want using the arrow keys versus trying to drag it. This little thing down here also lets you change the height. So if you're really just tweaking on one value, I think, yeah, Alt-E will expand just that track.